but I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Turrbal in Yagara country in Meanjin in Brisbane, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. I want to thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Liz O'Brien. I'm the CEO of the Queensland Trust for Nature, and the Trust has a long association with Nature Refuge in Queensland, and we've protected over 118,000 hectares over the last 20 years. But I'm also the chair of the Policy and Government Relations Committee with ALCA, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. And ALCA is the peak national body for organisations that conserve, steward and restore nature on privately owned or managed land. It's an independent non-government organisation, and ALCA advocates for a healthy, resilient Australia where nature thrives. So today we've invited you to join us in an information session on why Queensland should exempt nature refuges from land tax. You'll hear from two of our panellists who I'll introduce in a moment, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. You'll see in your Zoom window down the bottom, there is a Q&A chat option. So if you've got questions throughout the session, please put them in there, and Monica will help me manage all the questions that you've got. If we can't answer all the questions in today's session, we will endeavour to also answer them after the session's finished when we provide you with a link to the recording. What else? So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to the panellists. So we have Michael Cornish. He is the policy lead for the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, and he's the author of the policy note that we'll be launching today. We have Deborah Metters. She's a self-employed ecologist who's worked as the regional coordinator for the Land and Wildlife Program in Southeast Queensland for over 20 years. She's helped the program grow into the well-respected and popular program that it is today. So thank you so much, Deb, for all your hard work over the years. Her unique position has enabled her to meet countless landowners who are doing conservation works on their properties throughout Southeast Queensland. And she also walks the talk. Last year, she bought her own nature refuge, and she's looking forward to protecting the big old trees and the wildlife that rely and depend on them. So thank you very much. We'll also have Monica Haynes. She's a communications manager from the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, giving us some tips on how, as landowners, we can help promote the agenda to have land tax being exempt from our nature refuges. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'll just share my screen. And I believe that's come up. So look, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. ALCA is launching a policy note today entitled, Queensland's Opportunity to Exempt Conservation Covenants from Land Tax. Yes, it's a very wordy title, but there's a surprising amount of policy that sits behind what seems like a very simple and hopefully effective proposition. I'm going to cover off on slides. There we go. Cover off on a couple of different things here today. Really just to set the scene around, well, why are privately protected areas? They're predominantly called nature refuges in Queensland. Why are they so important? The policy context that I guess that layers behind the importance of these protected areas. Why it is that ALCA is focusing on land tax, at least in the first instance, and then we'll provide you a link to the policy note. Also, just a quick disclaimer, even though we're obviously covering off on tax policy, I want to make it clear we're not providing legal or financial advice. I'm not from Queensland. I would not want to be pretending to give you advice on the your personal situation with Queensland land tax. So. All right, just as a very top level view on this, it's very well recognised that protected areas are the most effective way to protect biodiversity. And we all know about national parks and conservation parks and the like. There's also Indigenous protected areas, and there in Queensland there's nature refuges. We also know that protecting nature has a dramatic impact on the GDP of both the globe, but also in Australia, in terms of what level of reliance that different sectors of our economy actually have on nature. And that's not always in a completely direct sense. It's often in an indirect sense. But the estimate in Australia is that 49% of Australia's GDP is either moderately or highly dependent on nature, which is about the same as the global average. We also know that privately protected areas are very important because in the lands that are in areas that are dominated by private tenure, by private land, they tend to be the most underrepresented in terms of protected areas across the country. So, in those sort of, I guess, agriculture, dominant sort of agricultural lands, or for that matter, close to metropolitan areas, don't have the same level of nature protection as other parts of the state. So I'll run through this very, very quickly, but really just to give you an indication that these protected areas actually have quite a layered pedigree, as it were. There's the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. There's a recent agreement through that convention called the Global Biodiversity Framework. Australia signed up to this, and one of the targets is delivering what's called 30 by 30. So that's protecting 30% of Australia's lands and 30% of Australia's seas by 2030. And Australia has signed up to that commitment at a domestic level as well. We have something called Australia's Strategy for Nature, which has that as one of our priority commitments. We have a national roadmap looking at how we will achieve 30 by 30 on land in Australia. And also we have a strategy for the National Reserve System. So this is all those different protected areas, the public protected areas that I've spoken to before, the Indigenous protected areas, and in Queensland, the Nature Refuges and Special Wildlife Reserves. And all of the states and territories and the federal government have signed up to this strategy for the National Reserve System, looking at how we build a proper protected area system across the country. And importantly in that, there's something called the CAR principles that stands for comprehensiveness, adequateness, and representativeness. And this is basically saying that, look, it's not enough to protect the areas where land, for example, might be cheaper or is not as contested in terms of its land use, and so therefore is easier to turn into a national park or what have you. We actually need to be protecting ecosystems across the country, and that means in the harder areas as well, the places which are dominated by private land. So hence, of course, the value of nature refuges. In Queensland itself, beyond signing up to these, these national commitments, they've signed up to contribute to those commitments, within the Environment Ministers' meeting back in October 2022. They also had their own protected area strategy, and they have their own target. So they don't have a 30% target. So in that sense, Queensland is not doing its fair share of the heavy lifting to get the national target up to 30%. They do have a 17%. What's called they've called it a long-term target. They don't have a date by which they want to achieve it. They really ought to have a date. And we're some distance off from delivering on that 17%. And so really it should be all hands to the wheel, as it were, to get us to that target. I've already referred to them briefly, but in Queensland, what are known as conservation covenants elsewhere across the country are often known by their more common name, Nature Refuges here in Queensland. There are also special wildlife reserves, a very special type of conservation covenant that is quite bespoke and, in truth be told, limited to, at this stage, to land conservancies. This is not, I guess, individual landholders that are pursuing special wildlife reserves, but they are one of the tools. And then there are also these voluntary covenants under the Land Title Act, which no doubt Deb will talk to more. They're technically not counted in that 30 by 30 protection target or Queensland's protection target, but they do obviously still play an exceptionally important role in terms of the conservation that's undertaken on those lands. And so in the policy note that we're launching today, we are also suggesting that these covenants should also be exempt from land tax. Something that's worth noting in the policy context is this: we're pursuing this agenda not on behalf of our member organisations. So ARCA is a peak body, we have member organisations, but we also seek to represent the broader sector, all those individual landholders out there that are doing great work on their land for nature. And our organisations as charitable institutions are already actually exempt from land tax in Queensland. So I guess I just wanted to make it clear that this is not a case of us pushing our own self-interest. No, this is about trying to pursue the public interest in protecting nature. So, okay, why focus on land tax? So I'm adopting a bit of an economics frame here. So when we look at the sorts of things that government should intervene and try to help support, usually we want to see that there's a good public benefit that's available. And I mean, I can go into the detail of this, but hopefully it's patently clear that the benefit from nature refuges is overwhelmingly public. There are clearly private benefits as a landholder. You get to enjoy, nature that, that's more directly accessible because it's on your land. And hopefully you get some other, personal benefits out of having a nature refuge. But there are lots of what we would call in economics positive externalities. So means even though you as a landholder might be the one providing all the work and the effort to maintain and protect that nature, the broader society gets those benefits in terms of, we've already talked about the reliance of lots of different sectors of the economy on nature and a well-functioning ecosystem across the state, and all the other sorts of ecosystem services that nature provides. And we could run through a big long list, but you would be aware of some of the more obvious ones, things like stopping soil erosion and, for example, providing habitat for pollinators, which benefits at the agricultural sector. There are plenty of others. And so if you've got essentially something that provides public benefits and there's not enough of these, these public benefits, enough people pursuing this, in this case, pursuing getting a nature refuge or a voluntary conservation covenant under the Land Title Act, then you have a different sort of standard suite of options. You could say, well, we can make it mandatory. It could be the government provides it directly, which they do to a certain extent by having their own conservation parks and national parks. You could try to make sure that people are aware of the benefits and therefore encourage people to do this voluntarily, because once they're aware of the benefits, they might be more willing to engage in establishing nature refuges and so on. But the one that we're focusing on here today really is subsidies, is saying that, well, actually having a financial incentive so that it's not as expensive to provide these public benefits is a really good idea. And the two most obvious ways are around, providing some funding support, and there are some grants. They're currently on hiatus, I understand, in Queensland. Hopefully we'll restart soon. But also then tax breaks is the other key one. And so hence why we're looking at tax. But also why land tax in particular? Well, look, every other state jurisdiction is exempt from land tax. Their conservation covenants, as they're called there, their nature refuges, none of them pay land tax. And that's essentially this public benefit case has already been well made, and the changes have been, except in Victoria, in place for quite some time. So Victoria is the most recent jurisdiction, or the second to last jurisdiction, as it were, to affect this policy change. And they started their exemption from the 1st of January last year. And really fascinating to see already the change in the level of interest in nature refuges there, where we've seen a more than double increase in the level of interest. So people putting in expressions of interest and then wanting to pursue these nature refuges in Victoria. So a dramatic uplift then in the that sort of public policy goal focus from individuals. And the other thing is that it's actually pretty low cost. Now, we don't know exactly how much it would cost in Queensland. That's a matter for Treasury, and Treasury has those numbers in a way that aren't fully accessible to the public. But we know that in Victoria, when they estimated how many properties were going to no longer pay land tax, because a number of properties don't pay land tax for other reasons, they worked out that it was going to be less than $1 million per year, which of course may sound like a lot to us as individuals, but to a state government, the size of Queensland is exceptionally minimal. Now, it may well be a bit more than that, but we aren't talking about hundreds of millions of dollars here. We're talking about a reasonably low cost, effective way of trying to incentivize people to establish nature refuges. Now, the other obvious questions that might be asked, I imagine if you're a landholder in particular, is, well, there are lots of other things that we care about too, and council rates often top that list. Why not focus on council rates? Because that would have a bigger, financial impact. Look, the truth is that that council rates are a very good thing to seek rebates for, and ARCA is very strongly supportive of that. Also, the politics, though, are a lot more complicated because land tax, of course, is levied by the state government. What that means is that it's politically easier for the state government to make a decision on changing it. Council rates, you then have to involve councils and you need to arrange for, well, is there a level of compensation and how would that compensation play out? So it immediately becomes a lot more complicated and involves a lot more, I guess, players in the political space. So that's the reason, I guess, why at this stage we're not prioritising this. Also, the approach to council rates across the country is a lot different. It's quite, it can be up to the individual council in some jurisdictions as to whether the rebate applies or not. So it's a harder change to put the case for because it's not uniform across the country. Whereas Queensland is the only jurisdiction that doesn't have an exemption for land tax for nature refuges. We know there are other issues around there not being a dedicated land use category for conservation. We know that there's an issue around the ongoing funding and support for landholders that have nature refuges and so on. There's always other opportunities the state government can pursue around supporting the environment. And none of what we're saying here today is to say that these things should not be pursued as well. But I guess we're just having a bit of a tight focus in terms of what we're pursuing at the moment. We still work on these other things as best we can, but we think there's a real big opportunity for land tax at the moment. And so here's the policy note, and we'll put this link into the chat so you can click through and have a look in your own time. But I will stop talking now and hand across to Deb, who can talk to you much more about the landholder experience and some of the perverse outcomes that currently occur because we don't have this exemption. So over to you, Deb.
Thank you so much, Michael. Let me share my screen. Great, that should all be sharing now. So thank you for that, Michael, and thank you, Liz, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm talking here from my office in Ipswich. I'm on Yagara lands, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people and to all custodians of this land. I'm a self-employed contractor and my business is Second Nature Environmental Services. How do we get this slide moving? There we go. So I want to talk about the programs that are delivered by these 13 local governments today in Southeast Queensland. They deliver a suite of private land conservation programs, some of which Michael's already referenced here. The entry-level program is Land for Wildlife. So my position is Regional Coordinator of the Land for Wildlife program. So I develop communication products and things for Land for Wildlife members and bring together those 13 local governments to work collaboratively together. I've been in my role for a while now, and I've been privileged to meet hundreds of Land for Wildlife members, many of whom who have conservation covenants on their properties. So just quickly, this Land for Wildlife program, it's an entry-level program. So what is it? It's a free program, and it's really focused around an extension service between the council officer and the landholder. So it's building that trust and support and relationship with the landholder to help provide advice and support for the landholder to achieve conservation on their properties. So it's non-binding on title, but our research has clearly shown that Land for Wildlife does act as a stepping stone for people that then go on to enter into a conservation covenant. And that's what we're talking about here today. I quickly wanted to show this chart, and it tracks the cumulative growth of the Land for Wildlife program over the last 25 years. And the point of this graph is not so much about Land for Wildlife, but just about the demand from the community for doing conservation. It's not slowing down. People want to do conservation and they want to have conservation covenants as an option on their property. So geographically, this is what the Land for Wildlife Southeast Queensland program looks like. This is 25 years of effort of those local governments, and we've got over 5,600 properties. Each dot represents a Land for Wildlife property. And these green dots on this same map are our properties with conservation covenants. So 6% of Land for Wildlife members or of Land for Wildlife properties at some point go on to enter into a conservation covenant. This 6% would be a lot higher if every landholder out there who wanted to get a conservation covenant could get one. There are a range of barriers preventing landholders from entering into a conservation covenant, and potentially the cost of this land tax is one of those barriers. As Michael mentioned, in southeast Queensland, there are two types of conservation covenants that are offered here, and this map shows both of those. So that the Nature Refuge conservation covenant offered by the state government, and then those voluntary conservation covenants through the Lands Title Act offered by local governments. How they're split is shown on this map, with the ones in green are those voluntary conservation covenants delivered by local governments. The ones in blue are the nature refuges, and the ones in red are actually properties that have both types of conservation covenant on them. All of these properties are also in Land for Wildlife. There are hundreds of examples that I could provide of landholders doing quite incredible work on their property to do conservation. This is a conservation covenanted property in southeast Queensland, and you can see that in 20 years, these landholders have basically created a forest and have restored not only their property, but helped that surrounding landscape, which really talks to those positive externalities that Michael referenced about the public good and about the benefits of private areas, protected areas going into the neighbouring and broader area. So why do people enter into conservation covenants? For a whole lot of reasons they are, but it's not an easy decision. There's financial considerations, family considerations, and the conditions of the covenant not only bind those owners, but all successive owners of that property. So definitely we find that people that enter into a conservation covenant are doing it because they care about their property long term, often well beyond their lifetime. And they also care not just about their property, but the landscape in which their property sits. So those people have made a significant decision to enter into a conservation covenant, and they're entering into a structure that is created by governments, ultimately to help governments meet their strategic policy goals. And as Michael said, you know, the Queensland government has that target of 17%. My understanding was about 8%. We're at about 8%, so they've got a ways to go. And then there's those international targets of 30 by 30. And really the only way that those governments can achieve that is by working with landholders who choose to enter into a conservation covenant. So entering into a conservation covenant is a big decision, but it does come with some costs. And there may be costs associated with actually meeting the conditions of the covenant, and that may be around fencing or fire management or weed control. And also we need to recognise that a covenant is an encumbrance on title and may reduce further future land management opportunities. And then for some landholders, there's this annual land tax bill, which we're talking about trying to get an exemption for today. And these are really these financial, trying to remove or replace these barriers or these costs with those subsidies that Michael was talking about. So I'd like to provide just a couple of real-life examples of how the current land tax system in Queensland is affecting some landholders with a conservation covenant. There's this property in southeast Queensland, and the landholder purchased it quite a few years ago. And at the time that they were purchasing it, the neighbouring block of land was also up for sale. That probably would have been cleared because it's in a rural residential area, and it was just bushland, and it happened to be endangered bushland. And they thought, you know what, let's buy that and let's put a conservation covenant on that to protect that so that it doesn't get cleared. So they did the right thing by doing that for public benefit, really. And now they're paying $11,000 annually in land tax because of that property that has a conservation covenant over it. And they're not quite sure whether they can continue to afford that. I also know of other landholders who want to do conservation and would like to have a conservation covenant, but they're instead making the decision to graze a cow or two on what would be marginal lands to receive the primary producer land tax exemption. So this is in effect the state government incentivising people to degrade the land rather than restore it or protect it. So it's I would definitely see it as the price of properties continues to rise, and that as the land tax bill continues to rise as well, that it will force people to sell these properties, and it will impede people wanting to buy properties with conservation covenants as well. So instead, governments could remove those barriers and also just simply say thank you to these landholders who are ultimately doing something to help the governments meet their targets. So increasing those kind of thank yous would drive more interest and uptake in conservation covenants. And those thank yous could look like regular grants, incentives, workshops and opportunities for like-minded landholders to get together and learn about conservation work on their properties. So there's a lot of opportunities to remove barriers and increase those thank yous or those subsidies that Michael referred to. In addition, it would be great to see local governments offering rate rebates, and Michael spoke a bit to this. And I'm pleased to say in South East Queensland that there are several councils that do this. And they offer quite generous rate rebates to landholders who have conservation covenants on their properties. And some of those local governments also recognise nature refuges, even though the local governments aren't sort of legislatively equipped to actually gazette nature refuges, but they are recognising the valuable role that nature refuges play and that state program by offering rate rebates and recognising nature refuges in their policy documents. So it's really great to see some of that happening. So in summary, landholders are doing the right thing by getting a conservation covenant. There's potentially costs that they're willing to incur, but to have that removal of that land tax cost would be something that actually says thank you. Thank you for helping us meet our policy targets as a government, and thank you for doing the work that you do. And that money would be much better spent on reinvested into conservation works rather than just going into general government revenue. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to reference a report that was commissioned by local governments quite a few years ago now. But it looked at the impacts of land values on land values of conservation covenanted properties. So if someone has an interest in that space, I'd invite you to look at that report online. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Monica. I'll hand over to you just to give a quick overview of some of the things that landowners can do to help promote this agenda. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Liz. Have you got my slides on the screen there? Okay, so these are just some practical steps that you can take to keep this issue on the agenda. The very first one that we've got is asking your MP to write to the Treasurer to find out why Queensland is the only jurisdiction where landholders have to pay tax on nature refuges. We have a template and instructions on our website. You can access that via the link that was put in the chat previously. We'll also include in an email afterwards with the recording. And so why do this? It's really just to help raise awareness. It raises the profile of the issue and it helps show decision makers there's a mandate for change. And we know that having the issue elevated by the landholders who are doing the work on the ground really helps complement the direct advocacy work that Elka and others are doing. The important thing with this is just to make sure that it is personalised rather than just a cookie cutter letter. So we have got prompts in there for you to, I guess, share why the issue matters to you particularly. Media coverage, another great one. So just another way of helping build political pressure needed to turn policy ambition into actual results. So again, just another tactic to raise the profile of the issue. We've had some recent success with a statewide story on the issue, and we think it's also a great story for regional news outlets. So all we need to do for that is add some local flavour with your voices. So if you can help us with that, do reach out to me directly. It shouldn't be onerous. It could be as simple as just providing a couple of sentences that we can add to a media release to send to local papers. or being available for a quick chat on radio if that's something that you feel you would be up for. Now, if media is something that you're interested in, but you're not sure if you're confident enough to do so, the Nature Media Centre, which is a new project of ALCA, the Biodiversity Council and Pew Charitable Trusts, is taking applications for free spokesperson training. I'll put the link in the chat for that and also include it in the follow-up that we're sending around. Finally, it's just about keeping this issue on the agenda, and I guess it's part of a broader conversation about what's needed to scale up and enable more people to protect and manage and restore nature. So if that's something you're interested in, we certainly encourage you to consider coming to our annual conference in Cairns in October. As part of that conference, we have a full-day landholder forum, which is about sharing the challenges and successes across regions and property types, learning what support is out there and where to find it. And it's about making your voice count and really shaping that collective call for support and recognition by decision makers. We had close to 100 people at the last landholder forum, had some great feedback. You can see that on screen. So hope to see you in Cairns. Thank you, Michael and Liz and Deb.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica. And thank you, Michael and Deb, for the perspectives that you've given to us. Before we reach out to the participants online for your questions, just a reminder, if you want to ask questions of the panel, we've got a great opportunity to use the next 15 minutes or so to get information or your questions answered straight away. If you can use the Q&A option. So we've got a webinar chat going, but there's also a Q&A option on the bottom of the toolbar in this Zoom webinar. If you click on that one and just type your questions in there. I'll start with a question for Michael in the meantime. So at the moment, I can see there's one question from John online that we'll address later. And there's no open questions at the moment in the Q&A. So I'll just remind everyone, this is your chance to ask questions in a nice, safe environment. But Michael, if I can start with you, we received a suggestion through a different forum about the tax exemptions should only apply to landowners or landholders who can demonstrate they're actively managing their nature refuge or their conservation covenant, and that they can pass monitoring compliance checks. What's your view on that idea?
Look, I am admittedly quite sympathetic to the idea that, a nature refuge is not going to be achieving its full potential if it's not being managed effectively. I guess the problem I have with the idea of providing, I guess, a penalty for those who aren't able to keep up with their management obligations is that it would, we're trying to incentivize people entering into nature refuges in the first place. There really needs to be a level of ongoing support from the government to help to help landholders meet those management obligations. We know that, some people who maybe they inherit a nature refuge, for example, that their ability to meet those obligations, it might be hard. It might be hard for them. So we're trying to, I guess, in the first instance, incentivize people to enter into these obligations, into a nature refuge in the first place. We're also trying to, I guess, make it less costly for them to do so. So I'm completely sympathetic. I just don't think that this is the right mechanism to achieve that. And Deb, you deal with these things on the ground day in, day out. You might have an additional view to that.
Look, I would agree, Michael, that there's people do their best, and I think that that's where the covenanting party, whether that be local government or state government, works in partnership, with the landholder to try to achieve the conservation outcomes that are put forward in a property management plan, which would be a standard thing. And how can both parties work together to achieve them long term? So that's about those thank yous, those incentives, those subsidies that we talked about, so that landholders don't feel alone in their journey, because remembering that a lot of that conservation work is for the public good. And so it's about sort of seeing just the signing of the conservation covenant is not the destination, it's the continuation of the conservation journey. The point of the exercise is conservation and good on-ground management. A conservation covenant is simply a mechanism that sort of protects that and sort of provides the direction for that property heading in that direction long term. So ongoing partnerships with governments is essential. to achieve those conservation goals on ground. So there shouldn't be a legal way to sort of have to monitor that. I'd say that is already happening in a lot of Southeast Queensland of those properties. Certainly in Southeast Queensland for those voluntary conservation covenant properties, the local governments go out and do annual compliance checks. They do a lot of that already. So I don't think that there needs to be directly a mechanism to prove that that's happening per se.
Thank you. It's great to see we are getting some questions. So I'll start asking them. There was one question from John that talks about intersections with carbon and biodiversity markets. I might just park that one for a moment, John, and answer some of the other ones that are still referring specifically to the land tax issue. So one of them comes from Elizabeth about just clarifying that this tax exemption request is applying only to the covenants and it won't be picking up the land for wildlife agreements at this stage.
That's correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
Sorry, you go, Deb.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Yep. Michael, did you want to explain a bit more why the land for wildlife wouldn't be appropriate at this point in time?
Well, Deb can speak to what the arrangements are behind land for wildlife more in more detail than I can. But in essence, it's not the same level of agreement that, in essence, requires the ongoing commitment to conservation in the same way. So, for example, it doesn't have that in perpetuity character of it being in perpetuity on title as well. So there isn't, I guess, the security. So if you're going to make an investment as the government, for example, and go, right, we want to incentivize this, well, we want to have some security, I guess, that it will be continuing on, and it might not be that a future landholder walks away from it.
Yeah. I think the next one I might put to you, Deb, from your experience with working with the local councils at SEQ. This is an anonymous question about liaising with the Local Government Association of Queensland. So maybe from your perspective of how it can interact with local councils and whether we need to make sure that this is also promoted through the Local Government Association of Queensland to help elevate the agenda and keep the issue on top of the agenda. So did you want to add a bit around that, Deb, about your experience working with councils?
Yeah, look, LGAQ is very aware of, the significant investment by local governments, certainly in Southeast Queensland, into supporting landholders to do conservation and the delivery of those various private protected area programs. So yeah, they're definitely aware of that. We're very lucky to actually, win an award from LGAQ last year for that collaboration of local governments in Southeast Queensland. But I think on the issue of land tax exemption, maybe there is a place for LGAQ to make some representation on that matter, given that local governments are already supporting a lot of those landholders. And if those landholders are really struggling financially with a land tax bill, there may be some role there for LGAQ to play.
Yeah. I think that's a good suggestion. Thank you for that. This is a bit more of a very practical question. So thanks for asking this, Richard. I think it's a really good one. This is about when preparing a letter to the local MP asking to query the Treasurer, what's the best way to word it in order to get them to actually respond with an action and not just that cookie cutter response? So Michael, I know you've got a lot of experience with how to write things in a way that gets action rather than just thank you very much for your letter.
Yes, well, in fact, for my sins, I used to in past life work in a federal crossbenchers office, and so I'd be on the receiving end of plenty of these sorts of letters. So it's a difficult question to answer easily. I mean, the reality is that when you contact, ultimately a minister that's responsible for a large department or even for a small department, you are inevitably very likely to get a standard, what they call in the business, a standard response back. However, so I guess it's more though about trying to impress upon your local MP about why this is important and why, you know, why they should care. So the purpose of going for the local MP is to, I guess, broaden the awareness raising, so that it doesn't just go to the Treasurer's office, for example, and the same advisor gets to, you know, punch out a standard response, as it were. So I don't have a good answer for you around how do you get a better standard response. It's probably more around getting a better response from your local MP, actually, because you'll get hopefully a more personalised response to your question.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We are getting to 11:42, and I know a few people have to leave at 11:45. We are happy to keep going till midday. So for those that can stay on, for those that haven't had their questions answered, as I said at the start, we will respond to them in the email where we send the draft letter, etc., out to you. But we will keep going. So there's this is another question for you, Michael, around the extent. So this is from Hadley. It's the proposal for the land tax to be exempt. Is it just the portion of the property that is under the conservation covenant, or is it, so it's a percentage, or is it the whole property that would be exempt from land tax? I think that's a good question, Hadley. Thank you.
yeah, look, it's only on what land is actually under the covenant itself, under the Nature Refuge or the voluntary covenant. And that's how it applies in every other state as well. So, you know, this is not meant to be, I guess, a backdoor way of getting your, you know, primary place of, you know, getting a residence exempted. It's really only for the land that's actually under conservation, because that's the public benefit component.
Yeah. This is another one from Lee, so I'll keep going on these ones because they're very specific and good questions. What states that have recognised the voluntary conservation agreements on title? So I think we've heard very clearly that it's everyone but Queensland. So in basically all states do recognise the voluntary conservation agreements for land tax exemption. I think just to clarify for Lee, in these states, do we know the proportions versus nature refuges? So I'm familiar with what goes on in Queensland, but in other states, are there different forms of conservation agreements that are exempt from land tax?
Look, so Southeast Queensland is quite unique in having, or rather the Land Title Act process that exists in Queensland is quite a unique one. There's not really a parallel or a clear parallel in other jurisdictions. And so I can't give you an answer then around what's the difference in proportions, because they largely don't exist in other jurisdictions. So the Southeast Queensland Covenant, I mean, I know it can technically be elsewhere, but that's quite unique. In terms of what the proportions are of properties with one versus the other in Queensland, I'd have to defer to Deb on that. I don't know the proportions.
Yeah, I think that's a big question to ask, and it would extend well beyond Southeast Queensland. So I'm not sure if you've got a feeling for that. Deb, I think the presentation, the slide that you showed with that breakdown of just for the land for wildlife at Southeast Queensland and what's a conservation covenant and in some instances a nature refuge. Do you think that's expanded throughout Queensland? Would we expect a similar sort of proportion?
I'd suggest not. I'm not, don't have full line of sight, but I'm not aware, in my knowledge, I'm not aware of any other local governments outside of Southeast Queensland that use that component of the Land Titles Act to deliver voluntary conservation covenants. Yeah. Remembering that piece of legislation came on board prior to nature refuges even being an option. So that is why some local governments picked up that mechanism very early on in the pace, and there's been benefits to continue that here in Southeast Queensland. If for a period of time nature refuges weren't available to landholders here, so that mechanism was still driven by local governments to ensure that covenants could get across the line here.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice feed into one of the points that Adrian has raised in the Q&A. Very pleased to see that ALCA's lobbying not just for land tax exemptions for nature refuge, but also for these voluntary environmental conservation covenants. Many examples of landowners who can't obtain a nature refuge in Queensland, which we know is the case. And I think we've answered that question, Adrian, about other states offering exemption for voluntary statutory covenants as a precedent. And the answer is yes, land tax exemption.
Yeah, just to very quickly clarify, because the language is a bit technical, of course. In other states, all the conservation covenants, that we're thinking of, they are voluntarily voluntary. Similar, of course, that nature refuges are a voluntary conservation covenant as well, technically. So, I know the language is very confusing, but the short version is, because Queensland has this, I guess, mechanism that's used quite quite expansively in southeast Queensland, it makes sense to provide that with a tax exemption as well. Otherwise, you're penalising a group of people who've happened to go through one mechanism and not another.
On that, Joshua's asked a question about, can a nature refuge lose its, I guess, its title, its recognition, if it does go unmanaged? Did you want to answer that, Michael?
Look, I would think that there must be some way of it being broken, sure, but I would think it'd be very, very, very difficult. And no doubt there would be very likely some requirement for remedy,
Yes.
some sort of legal remedy. So you would be required to put it back into a covenantable condition, and if for whatever reason, say you, I don't know, bulldozed it illegally and put a car park on it, you might be required to restore a similar amount of land somewhere else. So whilst technically you might be able to get rid of a covenant somewhere, I don't imagine it's a good pathway to go down in terms of your prospects of, I wouldn't rate your legal prospects very strongly, let's put it that way.
No, I think in particular the nature refuge, you will be required to repair, restore, or compensate.
Yeah, it'd be matter for the courts, though.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Deb?
No, I'd agree with that sentiment. Yeah. From my understanding, there hasn't been one. There hasn't been an example of that play out in Queensland, in my understanding.
No, agree. So one of the questions is about, aside from land tax for local rates, wondered if there's any property valuers who'd like to partner and learn how to better understand a nature refuge and to be able to better value protected areas, protected properties, sorry. Certainly, as from our perspective at Queensland Trust for Nature, it's very interesting. And the point that the paper that you've included too, Deb, the link in your presentation about how does it impact on the value of the land? We're finding that it's not, and I think that's what your paper has said as well. But you're absolutely right. Is it Natalka that the valuers are the ones that also need to understand the value of a nature refuge or a covenanted property and the impacts that it would have on a property valuation. We've just recently sold, I think, 8 properties, and the valuation is equivalent to what you would get for a normal property. So yes, I agree. I think helping land valuers understand the value of having a covenant on a property would be a good step as well, beyond the land tax. Did you want to add anything to that, Deb?
No, I think we're sort of, as conservation covenant industry matures, we are going to see a price point probably change, where people will actually see benefit and will probably pay a price premium for a covenanted property. But it is very important to think about the covenant as an encumbrance, and if it does remove future subdivision opportunities or things like that, then the price will also reflect that reduced opportunity. So yeah, certainly a covenant can go both ways, is what I'd suggest in terms of price.
Thanks, Deb.
And just briefly on that, I mean, all states and territories have a process of being able to challenge your land valuation. The only, caution there, of course, is that they could always come back and say it's actually worth more than more than they said it was originally. So it's a pathway that must be walked into very carefully, I think. But there is obviously a process of trying to challenge it if you think that they've overvalued your property.
Or it's even, I think, the instances where you go to buy one and the valuers, the banks are not valuing it to the level it deserves. Tony, I'll get Michael to answer this question just again to clarify this. A landowner who lives on the nature refuge already exempt from land tax is one of the questions.
So Deb can probably actually give you a better answer on this. My understanding is that yes, in certain circumstances. So it's not a quick yes or no answer. And I mean, really, I'd encourage you to get independent advice on it rather than relying on my assessment. But Deb, is that broadly correct?
Well, my understanding is, how land tax is calculated, it depends on primary place of residency and total land assets. So there's a range of calculations, they're publicly available to know how the state calculates land tax, and it does depend on whether if you are generally living on your property and that is your primary place of residency, then everyone is exempt from land tax from your primary place of residence, is my understanding.
Yeah,
I imagine there must be a limit to the land that counts as your primary place of residence, though. So if you are trying to claim that you live on a 100,000 hectare primary place of residence, and it's all a nature refuge other than your property, you might be in a bit of different trouble. But yeah.
I do think that's a very, very good point that you led with, though, Michael. It is a very complicated area, so get advice about your own situations. I'll go back to a question that John put in quite early on. And I've held off, John. I hope you're still in the webinar, because it was a bit outside the land tax discussion. But since we've got 2 more coming in the meantime, but I'll ask it anyway. How would this interact? And I'm assuming, John, you're asking, how would the land tax exemption interact with conservation landowners making money from protection via carbon or biodiversity credits? This is a moving feast, this space. So I don't know if that's...
Yeah, so I mean, our proposal is not that if you have a carbon project or a project under the nature repair market, which was only just recently launched, we're not trying to argue that should be exempt from land tax. We would be basing it purely off the covenant itself. That's what would give rise to an exemption, and that's the approach that's taken across, as I say, the rest of the country. In terms of whether you then can have a covenant on that land once you've got a project will really depend on the particular method. And again, you'd probably need, you'd need independent advice on that and what's appropriate. Certainly, both those markets have what are called additionality tests. So, if you were looking to do something, do one of those projects on a place that was already covenanted, you'd have to make sure you fulfill those, I guess, additionality requirements of each of the markets, so that you're doing something genuinely additional, not just doing something that's already there, if that makes sense. But it becomes very complex very quickly, and yes, again, you would need independent expert advice on that.
Yeah. Again, this is a bit outside of just specifically the land tax question, but we do have a few more minutes, so we'll see if you're happy to answer this one as well. So should we be successful with land tax exemption, will ALCA and QTFN be approaching DETSI to discuss current resourcing to service potential increase in demand in nature refuging? From the perspective of QTFN, Gavin, yes, and we have started those conversations. QTFN was supporting the Queensland government in processing and assessing properties for nature refuge status, and we're very keen to do that again, and so help support the government and certainly help increase resourcing to service that demand, which is great. It was great seeing your stats, Deb, on the continued increase in interest. Whether ALCA is their next step, I think, like Michael, what you said at the start is that we're picking the low-hanging fruit, which is every other state has done this. Queensland, it's your turn. What about the next?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, just to give you a bit of broader context here. So we've obviously got a new state government. The funding essentially for private land conservation, they're running on previous government appropriations, and that funding is, well and truly running out. There's very little of that left to spend in that sense. And we know that the new government is looking around, well, how do we package up our thinking on stewardship and support for landholders to protect nature and, restore nature on their properties? Now, that could be through a nature refuge. It could be through these voluntary covenants and the Land Titles Act. It could be through, for example, programs that are in the reef catchments. There's a range of things that may or may not involve an actual covenant. So they're looking at, well, what's the package of support that we can provide to all sorts of different types of landholders that want to enter into I guess a low requirements agreement, all the way through to, that in perpetuity protection that we're talking about with these covenants. So, the long story short is we're working on it, and we know that the government is contemplating it. And so it's certainly in the mix of what we're advocating to government and trying to come up with a fulsome, package of support.
Yeah.
I would love to see more support offered by the state for nature refuge landholders. Again, getting a nature refuge agreement or getting a conservation covenant is not the end. That's a continuation of the conservation journey to get good on-ground conservation outcomes. That's the point of the exercise, and that needs that ongoing relationship, the ongoing resourcing for good land management and conservation land management on those properties. So I'd love to see resourcing increased from the state because it is very poor.
So something actually to add to that, that we hadn't, I guess, touched on too heavily is, I mean, private land conservation is quite a lot cheaper in many regards than trying to create new public protected areas, so conservation parks and national parks. Now, this is not an anti-parks a message. I'm not trying, there's clearly a place for, that type of protection and access to the public and so on. It's, that's very important. But increasingly, as, land value really goes through the roof, across the country, then, working with existing landholders rather than trying to acquire new land means you can pay those ongoing management costs without having to do with a land acquisition cost. So it is, in that sense, a cheaper way. It's not appropriate in all circumstances, but where it is appropriate, it is a cheaper way than trying to buy the land from underneath someone and then manage it, yourself. So, it's a very cost-effective way of being able to try to support, conservation.
100%. And it keeps people on the country as well, which is what is needed.
Yeah. I think that's been a fantastic conversation. We've got 2 minutes till 12, so I'll just wrap it up now. Thank you, everyone. I think it looks like most people were able to hang online with us, so thank you. Some of the questions in the chat about will we be able to have this recording? Yes, you can, and we'll provide other pieces of information. So remember, Monica's practical actions about keeping this issue on the agenda. If you're a landowner, it's very valuable if you take a copy of that letter and personalise it and send it to your local MP. If you are keen for others to hear your voice and your experiences about being a landowner, media coverage is a great way to connect people with the real lived experiences. So reach out to Monica if you're keen to do that straight away. If not, as Monica said, ALCA is investing in a media centre to help give us all spokespersons training, so you don't just have to jump straight into being on your local radio. You can potentially get some training to start with, so consider that as well. And thank you so much. So she's put it in the chat window. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Michael and Deb, for sharing your knowledge and expertise, and Monica for the work that you do behind the scenes too to help us keep this issue on the agenda. I look forward to seeing this issue progress, and thank you so much, everybody.